They threw me out like trash, yelling at me. We don't need such an old woman here anymore. I invested my severance pay not in a mortgage, but in shares of a small but promising startup. Now, when we discuss the merger, I'll be sitting across from them, and I'll have a button to mute their microphone. If you're ready for this journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this a like so you don't miss the updates. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's always lovely to see where everyone is. All right, let's get this started. Grab your coffee or maybe something a little stronger because this is a story that still gets my blood up. My name is Eleanor Vance, and until a little over a year ago, I was the Senior Vice President of Brand Strategy for Sterling & Finch. You probably know them. Heavy catalogs that could stop a door, classic furniture your grandmother probably coveted, and a brand image as solid and unchanging as a mahogany dining table. I should know. I built that image. For 35 years, I poured my life into that company. I started in the mailroom, worked my way through marketing, and ended up with a corner office that looked out over the whole city. I wasn't just an employee, I was part of the foundation. I remembered when old Mr. Sterling himself, Blake's grandfather, would walk the floors and know everyone's name. But those days, as I found out, were long gone. The end came, as so many things do these days, in a little box on my computer screen. It was a Tuesday morning. The email was bland from an HR person I didn't recognize. Mandatory Q3 strategic repositioning update. It sounded important and soul-crushingly boring, just another corporate hurdle in a week full of them. I logged on to the Zoom call from my home office, the one I'd painstakingly decorated with, ironically, Sterling & Finch pieces from their heritage collection. On the screen were two faces. One was the HR girl, probably no older than my own daughter, with a professionally neutral expression. The other was Blake Sterling Jr. Blake. 30-something, slicked-back hair, teeth too white to be real, and the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from being born on third days. He'd inherited the CEO title from his father about a year prior and had been swaggering around the company ever since, talking about disruption and synergy and all the other buzzwords he'd learned at his fancy business school. He saw me and the other senior staff as relics, dinosaurs who didn't understand the fast-paced digital world. Never mind that I had spearheaded the company's first website or launched our initial and very profitable e-commerce division. To him, my age was a liability, not an asset. The call started without any preamble. No, hello, Eleanor, how are you after 3.5 decades of service? Just Blake launching into a stream of corporate jargon about optimizing human capital and pivoting to a more dynamic, youth-oriented vertical. It took me a second to cut through the nonsense and understand what he was really saying. They were firing me. After 35 years, my career was being terminated in a 5-minute video call. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask for an explanation, to list my accomplishments, to defend my very existence within that company, and nothing happened. I looked down at the screen. The little microphone icon next to my name had a red slash through it. They had muted me. I was clicking at it, my hand starting to tremble, but the host had disabled my ability to unmute. I was just a face in a box, a spectator at my own execution. That's when Blake leaned in, his face filling the screen with that smug, condescending smirk. The HR girl looked away, suddenly fascinated by something on her desk. Blake knew I couldn't respond. He had all the power, and he was going to enjoy this moment. "Look, Eleanor," he said, dropping the corporate speak for a tone of blunt cruelty. "We're going in a new direction. It's a young brand now, energetic, fast. We need a team that reflects that. We don't need such an old woman here anymore." An old woman. The words hit me harder than any formal termination could ever. It wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about performance. It was about my graying hair, the laugh lines around my eyes, the number on my driver's license.
Before I could even process the full sting of his words, the screen went black. A message popped up. The host has ended the meeting. And that was it. 35 years. Gone. My email was locked, my company access denied. I just sat there, staring at my own reflection in the blank monitor. A silenced 63-year-old woman in a room full of furniture she'd helped make famous. The silence in my office was deafening. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. He may have muted my microphone, but in that moment, he'd managed to mute my entire world. But what Blake, in his infinite youthful arrogance, didn't know was that you don't spend decades navigating a corporate boardroom without learning how to fight. You don't get to my position by being a wallflower. And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out. The days that followed were a blur of shock and what I can only describe as a deep, profound grief. It felt like a death. In a way, it was. The death of Eleanor Vance, the SVP. The death of a routine I'd had since I was in my late 20s. My late husband, Robert, had been so immensely proud of my career. He'd been an accountant, a numbers man through and through, and he loved that I had excelled in the more creative, chaotic world of branding. "You build the castles, Ellie," he used to say, "and I'll make sure they're built on a solid foundation." He'd passed away 3 years earlier, and in a way, my work at Sterling and Finch had been my last real connection to the life we'd built together. Now, that was gone too. A week later, a courier delivered a thick packet, the severance agreement. It was clinical, cold, and utterly impersonal. A check with a decent number of zeros on it, enough to be considered generous by legal standards, but nowhere near enough to compensate for a lifetime of dedication. It was hush money, designed to get me to sign the ironclad NDA and disappear quietly into retirement. Don't talk about the company, don't talk about Blake, don't disparage the brand, just take the money and fade away. For about a month, I almost did. I wallowed. I watched terrible daytime TV. I doom-scrolled on my tablet. I answered worried calls from my daughter, Chloe, with a tired, "I'm fine, honey." But I wasn't fine. I felt like a ghost. I had all this energy, all this knowledge, all this experience coiled up inside me with nowhere to go. I felt obsolete, and I hated that feeling more than anything. The turning point came during a visit from Chloe. She found me on the sofa at 2 in the afternoon, still in my pajamas, watching some judge yell at people on television. She took one look at me, turned off the TV, and sat down with a determined expression. "Mom, are you going to let him win?" I looked at her confused. "Win? Chloe, he's the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation. He already won." "No," she said, shaking her head. "His goal wasn't just to fire you. His goal was to make you feel worthless, to make you believe what he said, that you're just some old woman who's past her prime. Are you going to let that be your story?" Something inside me snapped. That old spark, the one that had taken me from the mailroom to the boardroom, flickered back to life. She was right. I wasn't the kind of woman who let some arrogant little punk write the last chapter of her story. Robert never would have stood for it, and neither would I. That evening, I didn't turn on the television. I poured a glass of good Cabernet, opened up my laptop, and started to do what I do best: research. Here's a little secret Blake never bothered to learn about me. My degree wasn't in marketing. It was in economics. Robert had always handled the taxes, but for 40 years, I had managed our personal investments. I knew how to read a balance sheet, and I knew how to spot value where others didn't. Robert used to joke that my superpower
wasn't just knowing what people wanted to buy, but knowing what companies were worth buying.
I already knew Sterling and Finch's weaknesses from the inside. Blake was hemorrhaging money on flashy collaborations with social media influencers who had the attention span of a gnat. He was ignoring the core loyal customer base, the people my age with disposable income, in a desperate and clumsy attempt to seem cool to 20-year-olds who bought cheap disposable furniture. He was failing to innovate their supply chain, leading to delays and quality control issues. He was a fool, steering a magnificent old ship straight toward an iceberg, all while preening for selfies on the deck. I wasn't interested in Sterling and Finch anymore, though. I was looking for its opposite. I spent days, then weeks, buried in industry reports, financial news, and trade publications. I was looking for the company that was going to eat Blake's lunch. And then I found it. A small Brooklyn-based startup called Artisan and Elm. On the surface, they were tiny, a minnow to S&F's whale. But as I dug deeper, I got excited. They were direct-to-consumer, cutting out the middlemen. Their supply chain was modern and ethical, a huge selling point for younger consumers. Their designs were fresh, clean, and sustainably sourced. And their founder and CEO, a whip-smart young woman named Maya Chen, had a vision that was clear, compelling, and everything Blake Sterling's wasn't. They were everything S&F should have evolved into but hadn't. They had a phenomenal product and a devoted, growing customer base. But what they didn't have was capital. They were running on fumes, struggling to scale up to meet demand. They were the biggest threat Sterling and Finch had, but Blake was too arrogant and dismissive to even see them as a competitor. I looked at my severance agreement lying on the dining room table. That check was meant to be my golden parachute into a quiet beige retirement, a final slap on the back as I was pushed out the door. But looking at the numbers for Artisan and Elm, an idea, a wild, audacious, beautiful idea began to form. What if that check wasn't an ending? What if it was a beginning? What if it wasn't a parachute, but a weapon? I pulled up Maya Chen's email address. My heart was pounding like it hadn't in years. I was about to bet my entire future, my security, not on a quiet life in Florida, but on a 28-year-old founder in a warehouse in Brooklyn. I was about to go to war, and I intended to win. I sent the email. It was short, direct, and to the point. I introduced myself not as the recently disgraced SVP of Sterling and Finch, but as a private investor and brand strategist with 3 decades of experience in the home goods sector. I told Maya Chen that I admired her vision for Artisan and Elm and that I believed her company represented the future of the industry. I asked for a 30-minute meeting to discuss a potential seed investment. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, my stomach doing a nervous little flip-flop. Her reply came in less than an hour. "Ms. Vance," it began, "I've followed your work for years. You're a legend. When are you free?" 2 days later, I drove myself to Brooklyn. I traded my tailored corporate suits for smart casual. Dark trousers, a silk blouse, and a good leather jacket. I didn't want to look like some stuffy executive coming to dictate terms. I wanted to look like a partner. The Artisan and Elm headquarters wasn't a sleek glass tower. It was a sprawling, renovated warehouse space buzzing with a kinetic energy that I hadn't felt in years. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood, coffee, and palpable ambition. Young people in jeans and hoodies buzzed around open-plan desks. Prototypes of chairs and tables were lined up against brick walls, and in the center of it all was Maya Chen. She was exactly as I had imagined, dynamic, sharp, with an intelligent spark in her eyes that immediately told me she didn't miss a thing. She couldn't have been more different from Blake. Where he was slick, she was authentic. Where he blustered, she listened. She gave me a tour of the workshop where their designers were collaborating with craftsmen, showing me the sustainable North American oak they used, the non-toxic finishes. It was impressive. It was real. We finally settled in her modest office, which was really just a glass-walled corner of the warehouse floor. She offered me a mug of tea and got right down to it. "So, Ms. Vance?" "Eleanor, please," I said. She smiled. "Eleanor.
I'll be honest, your email was the biggest shock of my year. We're bootstrapping this whole operation. We're getting killed on logistics, our marketing budget is basically whatever's left over after payroll, and we have a 3-month wait list for our most popular dining set. We're at a breaking point. A good breaking point, but a breaking point nonetheless. Why us?
I looked her straight in the eye. Because you're doing everything Sterling and Finch should have been doing 10 years ago. Because you respect your customers, you respect your materials, and you've built a brand with a soul. My old company has lost its soul, Maya, and that's why you're going to beat them. I then laid out my proposal. I told her I wasn't interested in a small stake. I wanted to make a significant investment, giving her the capital to solve her production bottleneck and launch a real marketing campaign. I wanted to use my entire severance package, every last cent, to buy a substantial minority share of Artisan and Elm. In return, I didn't want a fancy title or a corner office. I wanted a seat on the board and a role as a strategic advisor. Maya just stared at me, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. She could see I was serious. This wasn't some bored retiree looking for a hobby. This was an all-in bet from one of the most experienced people in her field. I saw the calculations running in her head, the mix of excitement and healthy skepticism. I knew she was wondering about my motives. So I told her. I didn't give her all the gory details, just the truth. My departure from my last role was, abrupt, I said carefully. The new leadership has a different vision. They believe experience is a liability. They believe women of a certain age have nothing left to contribute. I would very much like to prove them wrong. A slow smile spread across Maya's face. Eleanor, she said, putting down her cup, I think we're going to get along just fine. I know this part is hard to hear. But it's important. The truth was about to come out, and it was going to be glorious. For 35 years, I had built a network. I knew the best suppliers, the sharpest logistics guys, the most creative marketers, and the most scrupulous accountants. And I knew which ones had been quietly miserable under Blake Sterling's clueless reign. My first few months at Artisan and Elm felt like a renaissance. For the first time in years, my ideas weren't met with yawns or condescending explanations of how millennials think. When I pointed out a flaw in their supply chain, Maya didn't get defensive, she got a notebook. When I suggested a targeted digital marketing campaign aimed not at college kids, but at established professionals in their 40s and 50s, the people who actually had the money for high-quality furniture, she didn't argue. She said, show me the data. I did, and we launched the campaign a week later. Our sales doubled in the first quarter, then they doubled again. We cleared our back orders and scaled up production. I worked from home mostly, a true strategic advisor. I wasn't just investing money, I was investing my knowledge, my network. My first big move was to poach a man named David Chen, no relation to Maya. Sterling and Finch's director of logistics. David was brilliant, a master of untangling shipping nightmares, and Blake had just passed him over for a promotion in favor of some crony from his MBA program. I called David. We had lunch. 2 weeks later, he was on Maya's team, completely revamping Artisan and Elm's distribution network and cutting our delivery times in half. Next was Sarah, a data analyst so good she could predict a trend 6 months out. Blake's team had her creating meaningless PowerPoint presentations about social media engagement. I offered her the chance to build an entire analytics department from the ground up at Artisan and Elm. She practically ran out of her S&F office. Slowly, carefully, we were building a powerhouse. Maya was the brilliant visionary, the heart of the company. I was the strategist, the ghost in the machine, leveraging decades of experience to guide our growth. David and Sarah were the first 2 bricks in a new foundation, a team built on talent and mutual respect, not age or nepotism. The first sign that we were on Blake's radar was subtle.
Sterling and Finch launched a new line of furniture called the Urban Loft Collection. It was a blatant, almost laughable imitation of Artisan and Elm's minimalist aesthetic, right down to the light-colored oak in clean lines. Except it was junk. They'd cut corners on the manufacturing, used cheaper veneers instead of solid wood, and the whole thing felt flimsy. It was a classic Blake Sterling move. See something successful and create a cheap, soulless copy. The furniture community saw it for what it was. Bloggers and design magazines tore it apart. Instead of hurting us, it actually helped us. Articles started appearing comparing their shoddy knockoffs to our authentic, well-made pieces. Our sales spiked again. It was the best free advertising I could have dreamed of.
I knew Blake would be furious. Not just that his plan had failed, but that it had backfired so spectacularly. He tried to swat at us like we were a fly, and in doing so, had put a giant spotlight on us. He had underestimated the intelligence of the customer, and he had wildly underestimated me. He was about to get exactly what he deserved, and I had a front row seat. Don't go anywhere. Blake still didn't see my hand in any of this. To him, Artisan and Elm was just some lucky little startup. He had no idea his old woman was the one calling the plays from the sideline. The success of our counter-narrative to his urban loft disaster emboldened us. We had a war chest now, thanks to our booming sales, and it was time to move from defense to offense. My strategy was simple and two-pronged. First, we would attack Sterling and Finch where they were weakest, their brand identity. Second, we would poach their greatest asset, their institutional knowledge. I hired a small, fiercely creative marketing agency and worked with them to craft a campaign. The slogan was, "Buy it for life, not just for a lifestyle." It was a direct shot at the trendy, disposable garbage Blake was pushing. Our ads featured real artisans in our workshop, shavings of wood clinging to their aprons. We highlighted the durability of our joinery, the sustainability of our sourcing, and the timelessness of our designs. The subtext was clear. We sell furniture. Sterling and Finch sells fads. We build heirlooms. They sell landfill. We aimed these ads squarely at their neglected core demographic, older, wealthier customers who were tired of being ignored. People like me, the ones who had been the backbone of S&F's success for generations and were now being treated as irrelevant. The response was electric. Our comment sections and social media pages filled up with messages from people saying things like, "Finally, a company that doesn't talk down to me," and "I used to be a loyal Sterling and Finch customer for 30 years, but I found my new home." Every single one of those comments was a satisfying little twist of the knife. Phase 2 was more personal. I knew there were dozens of people still at S&F who felt like I did. Seasoned veterans who had been sidelined, their experience dismissed in favor of Blake's new guard of yes-men. I started making calls, quiet coffees, discreet lunches. I never made it about revenge. I made it about opportunity. I offered them a chance to build something new, to have their voices heard, to be part of a company that was innovative and growing rather than a legacy brand that was stagnating and rotting from the head down. One by one, the dominoes began to fall. We got their head of materials procurement, a woman who knew every lumber mill owner from Oregon to Pennsylvania. She immediately secured better pricing and higher quality wood for us than S&F was getting. We hired away 2 of their top furniture designers, a husband and wife team who were tired of seeing their classic designs rejected in favor of whatever was trending on Instagram that week. The most satisfying acquisition, though, was Marcus, the former head of customer service. Marcus was a company man, loyal to a fault, who had worked there for 25 years. He believed in treating customers with respect. Blake had tried to replace his entire experienced US-based team with an overseas call center to save money, and it had been an unmitigated disaster.
Customers were furious, and Marcus's hands were tied. When I called him, he was just weeks away from resigning. I offered him the chance to create the best customer service experience in the industry at Artisan and Elm with a full team and my complete backing. He almost wept with gratitude. He gave his notice to Blake the next day. It had been nearly a year since my firing. In that time, Artisan and Elm had grown from a niche startup into a serious player. Our revenue had increased tenfold. We were the darlings of the business press, a David and Goliath story. And Sterling and Finch? Their latest quarterly report was dismal. Sales were down, their stock was flat, and for the first time in its history, the company was starting to look vulnerable. Blake had tried to fix a ship that wasn't broken, and in the process, he drilled a dozen holes in the hull. Now it was taking on water, and half his experienced crew had just jumped ship to join my brand new lifeboat. Blake thought he was playing checkers, dismissing us with a smirk. He had no idea I was setting up a chessboard, and my next move was going to put his king in check. The tipping point came not with a bang, but with a press release. It was an announcement from a private equity firm, Westwood Capital, that they had acquired a significant, though not controlling, stake in Sterling and Finch. I knew Westwood by reputation. They were corporate sharks. They didn't invest in companies to grow them. They bought into struggling legacy brands, stripped them for parts, laid off half the staff to cut costs, and then sold the emaciated husk for a quick profit. For them to be circling Sterling and Finch meant their financials were even worse than the public reports suggested. The sharks smelled blood in the water.
Blake, in his arrogance, probably saw the investment as a victory, a vote of confidence. He put out a memo to his staff filled with corporate jargon about strategic partnerships and being poised for unprecedented growth. I knew better. Westwood hadn't bought into Blake's vision, they had bought his company's debt. They were now his biggest creditor. They weren't partners, they were his new bosses, and their primary goal was to get their money back, with interest. Blake just didn't realize it yet. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. With the best of S&F's talent now on my team, Artisan and Elm was firing on all cylinders. We had just closed another record-breaking quarter. While S&F was starting to rot, we were thriving. I called an emergency board meeting with Maya and our small team of advisors. "It's time," I told them, laying out Westwood's press release on the conference table. "Sterling and Finch is on life support. Westwood is going to pressure Blake to stop the bleeding. He's going to slash his workforce, cheapen his products even further, and liquidate assets. He will destroy a 100-year-old brand to save his own skin for one more quarter. But there is another way." Maya looked at me, her eyes wide. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we make them an offer they can't refuse," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "We buy them." The room was silent for a moment. Then David, our logistics chief, let out a low whistle. "Buy Sterling and Finch? Eleanor, we're doing great, but they're still a giant. We don't have that kind of capital." "No," I corrected him, "we don't, but we have something far more valuable. A functioning business model, skyrocketing growth, and a clear vision. Westwood Capital, on the other hand, does have that kind of capital. And right now, they're looking at their investment in S&F and realizing they bought a lemon. I'm willing to bet they'd much rather own a smaller piece of a thriving company than a bigger piece of a sinking one." My plan was audacious. We wouldn't try to buy S&F outright. We would propose a merger. We would offer to merge Artisan and Elm with Sterling and Finch. On the surface, it would look like the big, established company was acquiring the small, plucky startup, but the terms of the deal would tell the real story. Maya would become the CEO of the new combined entity. Our executive team, David, Sarah, Marcus, and the others, would take over the key leadership positions, and Artisan and Elm's ethos of quality, sustainability, and customer respect would become the new guiding principle. We weren't buying their company, we were staging a reverse takeover. We were absorbing their assets and their history, but installing our brain and our soul.
It took a week for my back-channel contacts to get me a meeting with Catherine Dunn, the senior partner at Westwood Capital, who was handling the Sterling and Finch count. She was a woman in her late 50s, with shrewd eyes and a reputation for being surgically precise in her business dealings. She agreed to a discreet lunch at a quiet, upscale restaurant in the financial district. She listened to my pitch without interruption, her expression unreadable. I laid out our growth charts next to S&F's decline. I walked her through my team's experience, most of it gained at S&F, and explained how we would revitalize the brand, trim the fat, namely Blake and his cronies, and merge Artisan & Elm's dynamic, modern approach with Sterling and Finch's heritage and brand recognition. Let's be blunt, Catherine, I concluded, pushing the files across the table. You bought a dying brand led by an incompetent fool. I'm offering you a way to not only save your investment, but to make it one of the most profitable deals your firm has seen in a decade. She was quiet for a long time, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the cover of our proposal. You used to work for him, didn't you? Blake Sterling. I saw in your background file he terminated you. I met her gaze without flinching. He told me he didn't need an old woman anymore. He was half right. He didn't need me, but it seems his company does. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I don't like losing money, Eleanor, she said, and I don't like incompetent fools. Put a formal offer on paper with my team. We'll arrange a board meeting. It's time Mr. Sterling faced the consequences of his repositioning.
He was about to get exactly what he deserved, and I had a front row seat. Don't go anywhere. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of activity as lawyers and accountants hammered out the official proposal. Westwood, as I had gambled, was more than eager to back our play. Catherine Dunn recognized a golden opportunity to salvage a bad investment. She strong-armed the Sterling and Finch board, of which her firm was now the most powerful member, into accepting a formal merger presentation. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday, almost a year to the day since my own firing. The irony was so thick you could have carved it with a chisel. This time, though, I wouldn't be a muted face in a box. I'd be sitting at the main table. Maya and I walked into that boardroom together. It was the same room where I had spent countless hours of my life, a place of polished mahogany and hushed power. The S&F board members were already seated, looking grim, and at the head of the table sat Blake Sterling, Jr. When he saw me, his jaw literally dropped. I've never seen a person's face drain of color so quickly. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His eyes darted from me to Maya, then to the Westwood Capital representatives flanking us, a look of pure, dawning horror spreading across his face. The gears were turning in his little head, but they were turning far too slowly. He just couldn't comprehend it. In his world, women like me just disappeared. We retired, we played bridge, we faded away. We didn't come back a year later at the head of the company that was about to swallow his whole. I offered him a small, polite smile and took my seat directly across the table from him. Catherine Dunn from Westwood called the meeting to order with brutal efficiency. As you know, she began, Sterling and Finch is facing significant financial headwinds. We've received a proposal for a merger with the company Artisan and Elm. Representing Artisan and Elm today are their CEO, Maya Chen, and their primary investor and strategic advisor, Eleanor Vance. She said my name with just a hint of emphasis, and I could see Blake flinch. Maya was brilliant. She stood and presented our vision for the combined company with poise and unshakable confidence. She laid out the data, the growth trajectory of Artisan and Elm versus the catastrophic decline of Sterling and Finch under Blake's leadership. She talked about revitalizing the brand, respecting the legacy, but innovating for the future. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Blake, finally finding his voice, sputtered. "This is insane! A joke! They're a tiny online startup. We're Sterling and Finch. We are not going to be taken over by her," he said, pointing a trembling finger at me. This was the moment. Catherine Dunn turned her cool gaze on him. She said with a voice dripping with ice, "With all due respect, Blake, under your leadership, being Sterling and Finch now means declining revenue, alienated customers, and a tanking stock price. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders to consider a viable path forward. This is the only viable path on the table." One by one, the other board members, cowed by Westwood's power and the undeniable numbers Maya had presented, began to nod in agreement. It wasn't even a debate. It was a surrender. The motion to approve the merger and proceed with the terms outlined in our proposal was passed. Blake just sat there, deflated, his face a pale, sweaty mask of disbelief. He had lost. He had lost everything his father and grandfather had built, and he'd lost it to the old woman he'd thrown away like yesterday's trash. After the vote, Catherine turned to me. "Eleanor," she said, her voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I believe you have a few final words regarding the transition." I stood up slowly, my heart calm and steady. I looked directly at Blake. He had muted me a year ago. Now the entire room was hanging on my every word, and he couldn't say a thing to stop me. He was, in effect, silenced. I stood up, the silence in that mahogany-paneled room so complete you could have carved it with a chisel. All eyes were on me. The board members, who had once barely acknowledged me, now watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Catherine Dunn had a look of pure, steely satisfaction. And then there was Blake. He was slumped in his chair at the head of the table, his swagger gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed shock of a man who had just watched his entire world crumble. I let the silence hang for a moment longer, just to savor it. "Thank you, Catherine," I said, my voice even and calm. "First, let me say on behalf of Artisan and Elm, we are excited to carry the Sterling and Finch legacy into the future. A legacy of quality, craftsmanship, and integrity. A legacy that has been recently neglected." I let my eyes rest on Blake. "A little over a year ago, I was in a meeting, a video call actually, where I was informed that my services were no longer needed. The rationale given was that the company needed a younger, more energetic direction. I was told, and I quote, 'We don't need an old woman here anymore.'" A few of the older board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had probably heard Blake use similar language before and had done nothing. "It's a curious business philosophy," I continued, slowly walking along my side of the table, my hand trailing lightly on the polished wood. "The idea that wisdom gained over decades is a liability, that loyalty is disposable, that you can dismiss a person's entire contribution with a click of a button." I stopped directly opposite him now, a long expanse of mahogany separating us, though it felt like a canyon. "Blake, on that call, you muted my microphone. You took my voice away because you didn't want to hear what I had to say. You didn't want to be challenged. You didn't want to face a different point of view. It's a habit of yours, it seems. You've spent the last year muting anyone who disagreed with you. Your experienced staff, your loyal customers, even your own company's history. And now, look, I gestured around the room. The board has just voted to take that microphone away from you permanently." I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "My only formal recommendation for this transition is this. Blake Sterling Jr.'s separation from this company is to be immediate and total. He will clear out his desk today. He will have no advisory role, no golden parachute beyond what his contract legally requires, and no further affiliation with the brand his grandfather built. I looked at Catherine. I assume Westwood's votes will support that motion? She gave a curt, decisive nod. That is acceptable. Blake looked up at me, his eyes pleading for the first time. The arrogance had been replaced by a pathetic, raw panic. I imagined he expected me to yell, to be cruel, to throw his own words back in his face with venom. But I didn't need to. The quiet finality of it all was so much more devastating. His pathetic attempt to humiliate me had led to his own utter ruin in front of his entire board. He had made his bed. I was just tucking in the corners.
The weeks that followed the merger were a whirlwind, but a deeply satisfying one. Maya, true to her character, took the helm with grace and a fierce determination. I took a role as the chairman of the new board of directors, not involved in the day-to-day, but acting as a senior guide, a consigliere. My first act was to personally call David, Sarah, Marcus, and the other key people we had hired away and offer them their old jobs back, but with more seniority, better pay, and real authority. I also established a new executive position, Chief Legacy Officer, whose sole job was to protect the brand's 100-year history of quality. I gave that job to Marcus, the customer service guy. He cried when I told him. We undid Blake's damage with surgical precision. We closed the cheap overseas call center and rehired Marcus's experienced domestic team, doubling its size. We discontinued the shoddy Urban Loft collection and literally sent the remaining inventory to be recycled. On the Sterling and Finch website, which had been plastered with TikTok influencers, we posted a formal apology to our longtime customers, admitting the company had lost its way and vowing to earn back their trust. It was an unprecedented move, and the business press went wild. Our old customers, the ones Blake had dismissed, loved it. They flooded back. My final confrontation with Blake happened about a month after the takeover. It wasn't a big, dramatic showdown, but something far more fitting. His lawyers were fighting his severance package, claiming he was being unfairly dismissed. It was nonsense, and they knew it. Our legal team requested a final deposition meeting to put the matter to rest. It was scheduled, deliciously, over Zoom. He appeared on my screen from what looked like a sterile, rented office. No corner suite with a view of the city anymore. He looked tired and small. I was there, along with Maya, and the chief counsel for the new combined company, which we were now calling Sterling and Elm. Blake tried to bluster, to talk about his vision and how the board had betrayed him. He tried to argue that his termination was personal, orchestrated by me out of spite. Our lawyer calmly let him ramble for a few minutes. Then, with a practiced motion, she looked at the host controls. "Mr. Sterling, you are not answering the question," she said coolly. "We've heard enough on this point." And then she did it. She clicked a button and the little red line appeared over his microphone icon. He was muted. He sat there on the screen, his mouth still moving, his face growing redder and redder as he realized no one could hear his pointless tirade. He was a face in a box, a powerless man yelling into a void of his own creation. I didn't feel a surge of vengeful glee. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of justice, of the world finally, beautifully righting itself. I let him flounder for about 10 seconds, watching him click impotently at his screen. Then I leaned forward and spoke, my own voice coming through crisp and clear. "Blake," I said softly, "it was never personal. It was just business. You see, the difference between me and you is that you thought my age was a weakness, but you were wrong. It's a strength. It's decades of knowing that quality is more important than trends, that relationships are more valuable than transactions, and that if you throw something or someone away, You'd better be sure they're not going to be worth a fortune to someone else a year later. I looked over at our lawyer. I think we're done here. She nodded and ended the meeting. The screen went black, and I was left, once again, looking at my own reflection in the blank monitor. But this time, I wasn't a silenced victim. I was a 64-year-old woman with laugh lines, graying hair, and the chairman of the board of one of the fastest-growing furniture companies in the country. This time, I was smiling. Today, Sterling and Elm is more successful than either company ever was on its own. Maya is a celebrated CEO. I work when I want, I travel, I spend time with my daughter and my grandchildren. I never went back to the S&F headquarters. The mahogany boardroom held too many memories, both good and bad. Our new headquarters are in the renovated Brooklyn warehouse, a place that smells of fresh coffee, sawdust, and the future. Sometimes a young person on our team will ask for advice, and I'll tell them my story. Not the whole sordid tale, but the important part. That being underestimated is a gift. That your experience is your superpower, and that no one, no matter who they are, has the right to mute your voice. You just have to find the right microphone. So, now you've heard my story. Pretty wild ride, isn't it? I'm so grateful to have shared it with you all. It makes me wonder, what would you have done in my place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
My grandmother told me this story. Thanks for watching this video. Bye bye!